Hey, all you true crime fans, this is Mike Ferguson.
And this is Mike Morford.
And we'd like to invite you to listen to our podcast, Criminology.
Launched in 2017, we've covered a variety of strange cases from murders to missing persons.
We dive into a variety of cases in both the U.S. and abroad.
Some of the cases are ones you may not have heard of, like the Pocatello babysitter murders or the Grinell murders.
Other cases we cover are some of the most historic in true crime, like the Tylenol murders and the Lindbergh kidnapping. We also dive into cases that are currently breaking thanks to DNA and forensic genealogy.
Sometimes you'll hear from people connected to the cases, like the interview we did with the brother-in-law of the Golden State Killer, Joseph D'Angelo.
There are close to 200 episodes of Criminology available to binge on right now, including full seasons covering the Zodiac Killer, the Golden State Killer, and Ted Bundy, and new episodes come out every Saturday night.
Subscribe to Criminology today, wherever you listen to your podcast.
You're listening to Zodiac Speaking, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, Scene of the Crime, 3 Men and a Mystery, DNA ID, and All Things Crime. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This is the Zodiac Speaking.
There's seemingly a lack of cohesive eyewitness statements about the timeline of Cheri Jo Bates, in that a Mexican-American student who knew Cheri saw her at the library at 5:30 p.m., whereas Detective Sergeant Bonine reported that a close friend of Cheri Jo Bates saw her approaching the library on Magnolia Avenue at about 6:10 p.m. and waved at her, but didn't get a response. At the same time, 6:10 p.m., Cheri was also spotted by an Air Force man who recalled her distinctive lime green Volkswagen traveling near Magnolia Avenue and a 1965 to 1966 bronze Oldsmobile following closely behind it. The 1969 Inside Detective magazine article about the Bates case stated that, quote, "The participants in the reenactment at the detective's request wore the same clothing and sat in the same seats they had occupied the Sunday night of the murder. They were also asked to park their cars in the same places they had on the night of October 30th. It had been determined that Cheri Jo, or a girl resembling her and in similar clothes, had arrived at the library at around 5:40 p.m. and waited about 20 minutes for the doors to be opened. The girl apparently entered the library as soon as the doors were open at 6 p.m. and checked out the book she had come for. Cheri Jo Bates had also called her co-worker Donna at the Riverside National Bank at 5:30 p.m. to ask her if she knew the whereabouts of her bibliography. As argued by Zodiac researcher Ray Grant, some of these statements appear in conflict, but can be pieced together to create a plausible timeline such as the following. Cheri Jo Bates was spotted near the library by the Mexican-American student at about 5:30 p.m., at which time Cheri noticed that she wasn't in possession of her bibliography. She then could have walked to the nearest payphone and made the call to Donna at Riverside National Bank shortly after 5:30 p.m., but Donna wasn't able to assist her in the matter. From there, Cheri would walk back towards the library. That's when she was possibly sighted by another eyewitness at 5:40 p.m. in the vicinity. This eyewitness was not 100% sure of the girl's identity, however, but the timeline appears to fit. Cheri would then walk back to her vehicle and then drive to her home at 4195 via San Jose to look for her paper. She arrived home around 5:55 p.m. and spent about 5 minutes looking for the paper. From there, she would head back to the library and be spotted on and near Magnolia Avenue at 6:10 p.m. by her friend and the Air Force man. She would park east of the library and enter the building, once again seen by the Mexican-American student, who was very confident that he had seen Cheri in the library the night in question. Cheri would then collect her reading material and leave the library sometime before 6:30 p.m. This is one theory that allows all of this stuff to have happened. The argument of what happened next has raged for 55 years. It was also claimed that a female student was walking through the ill-fated alleyway at around 9:30 p.m., where she spotted a male individual smoking a cigarette. He was standing in the shadows. The credibility of this claim may be backed up by the later DNA testing performed in 1999 on items collected from the crime scene, which included a blood clot from the base of Cheri Jo Bates' right thumb, blood staining on her bra, and a cigarette butt. This could possibly be the cigarette butt retrieved from the location where the female student spotted the man in the alleyway, indicating that law enforcement deemed it a credible enough sighting and relevant to the investigation. The cigarette butt had a DNA concentration of 0.003 nanograms per microliter.
At autopsy, Rennie Modglin attempted to narrow down the time of death of Cheri Jo Bates by analysing her body temperature and stomach contents. He stated that, quote, "The state of rigor mortis, post-mortem lividity and body temperature at 9:23 a.m. on the 31st of October 1966 indicated she had been dead between 9 and 12 hours. This would place her time of death between 9:23 p.m. on October the 30th and 12:23 a.m. on October the 31st, and in line with the screams heard that night around 10:30 p.m. However, he also stated that the gastric contents suggest she had eaten a supper-type meal, probably not more than 2 to 4 hours before her death. This would place her time of death, had she eaten a supper-type meal around 4:30 p.m. at home, at between 6:30 p.m. and 8:30 p.m. This is in conflict with the possible female eyewitness who walked through the alleyway at 9:30 p.m, as well as the ear witnesses who heard screams in the vicinity of the alleyway at around 10:30 p.m. Ray Grant argued that Cheri Jo Bates may have been abducted from the area of the library shortly after she arrived, and the ensuing fear and stress of her abduction caused the digestive processes to slow down, hence the discrepancy between the time of the screams and the stomach content analysis. It is undeniable that fear, stress, and physical exertion does play a role in dramatically altering the rate of stomach digestion, but the analysis of using stomach contents to determine the time of death has come a long way since Rennie Modglin performed this autopsy in 1966, thereby rendering his claim of Cheri Jo Bates having eaten a supper-type meal probably not more than 2 to 4 hours before her death as a mere rough guide, and could have been considerably longer. Professor Bernard Knight, a world expert in forensic pathology spanning 45 years, having performed 25,000 autopsies, recently appeared on the Brian Bruce documentary series and stated in respect to analysing stomach contents to determine the time of death, quote, "Stomach contents are notoriously inaccurate. There have been a number of cases where there have been miscarriages of justice because people have depended on this. In all these matters, there is a norm. Most people's stomachs empty within, say, 2 to 4 hours, but there are so many variables. Even a range in the same individuals on different days. Depends a lot on the type of food, and especially the amount of liquid in the food. The gastro-ontological physiologists, they can give you examples of ranges going up to perhaps 10 hours even. If you add fluid to the solid meal, then the fluid tends to leak out before the rest and leaves the more solid stuff behind. So putting the stomach content analysis aside, we are left with post-mortem lividity and body temperature, placing her murder at 9:23 p.m. to 12:23 a.m., and strengthening the case for the screams and murder being one single event.
A few vehicles were mentioned in the investigation that may or may not be relevant to the murder of Cheri Jo Bates, one of which was the 1965-66 bronze Oldsmobile spotted by the Air Force man behind the Volkswagen of Cheri Jo Bates at 6:10 p.m. In his book, Zodiac Unmasked, Robert Graysmith wrote the following, quote, "Cheri Jo checked out 3 books from the local college library. Though her friends were at the small, cramped library between 7:15 p.m. and 8:57 p.m., none recalled seeing her there. At 9:00 p.m., when the archives closed, she returned to her car to discover the engine would not catch. Parked behind her car was a Tucker torpedo that had not been there before. Obviously, there's nobody that saw her return to her vehicle at 9 p.m., as Graysmith claimed. But the fact he mentioned a rare Tucker torpedo, of which only 51 were ever made, seems to add some credibility to the sighting, whether or not it has any relevance to the crime. After the library reconstruction, a November article appeared in the Daily Enterprise. It stated, quote, "Detectives investigating the murder of Cheri Bates are looking for a car almost identical to this one. Police say a 1947 to 1952 model Studebaker with light-colored, oxidized paint was parked on Riverside Avenue just south of Terracina about 7 p.m. on the night that the Riverside City College freshman was stabbed to death. Detectives said a recent reenactment of the murder at the college campus provided this information. They ask anyone who knows of a car similar to this one used by police to stage this photograph to contact the police department. The noteworthy part of this newspaper article is that they describe the vehicle as a 1947 to 52 Studebaker, and a 1947 Studebaker has an almost identical front end to that of a 1948 Tucker torpedo.
Because we cannot conclusively prove that Cheri Jo Bates returned home from the library to search for her bibliography, let us run with the notion of a one-time visit to the library by Cheri Jo Bates. One of the library reconstruction attendees, Walter Siebert, stated that he and a few friends were in the library from 7:15 p.m. until 9, but did not see Miss Bates, whom they all knew. They said they saw 4 men dressed in work clothes sitting on a fence across from the spot where Miss Bates' car was found, but they did not know them. To our knowledge, nobody knows the whereabouts of Cheri Jo Bates from about 6:30 p.m. onwards. Walter Siebert was reported as saying he saw 4 men sitting across from where Cheri Jo Bates' vehicle was found, not where it was spotted that evening. The 4 workmen stated they had seen Cheri near her car the previous night. The 4 workmen couldn't have seen Cheri Jo Bates while sitting on this fence shortly before 7:15 p.m. because then investigators would have been aware of her whereabouts at this time. Therefore, the 4 workmen must have seen Cheri near her vehicle at an earlier time. Had this been when she first arrived at the library, exited her vehicle and entered the library, they, to our knowledge, didn't mention anybody loitering suspiciously and no one tampering with her vehicle. Had they noticed Cheri returning to her vehicle after checking out the library books, they again seemingly mentioned nothing suspicious and do not mention Cheri Jo Bates struggling to start her vehicle or being approached by any good Samaritan offering help, especially when we consider the wording in the confession letter of, quote, "I first pulled the middle wire from the distributor, then I waited for her in the library and followed her out after about 2 minutes. The battery must have been about dead by then. I then offered to help." Had anything like this occurred, then surely the 4 workmen would have reported this. Nothing points to her vehicle being disabled shortly after she arrived at the library, followed by her murder shortly thereafter. Cheri Jo Bates could easily have used the library telephone and sought assistance from any number of people within it, rather than venture off into the darkness and leave her prized vehicle in the condition it was found the following morning. Notwithstanding the fact that screams heard about 10:30 p.m. do not tally with the claims made in the confession letter, and no body was noticed by the female student who apparently travelled down the alleyway at 9:30 p.m. The overriding conclusion is that the author of the confession letter was manufacturing a work of fiction, stitched together by an individual who simply read the newspaper reports of the crime and attempted to weave an elaborate story implicating themselves as the perpetrator. Again, a confession letter created by a sick, boasting braggart who chose to oppose this portrayed image by using the wording of small knife in direct conflict to the machismo presented. Words chosen deliberately to sell the notion the author was the murderer, and again, words gleaned from the newspapers, who widely reported that the knife was indeed small.
Many suspects have emerged as candidates for the Zodiac killer, or the murder of Cheri Jo Bates, which currently have yet to be fully substantiated as connected to one another. Riverside Police Department very quickly latched onto a suspect known by the name of Bob Barnett, which is a pseudonym given to him for online discussions, and is not his real name. This man has long been considered by Riverside Police as their prime suspect in the murder of Cheri Jo Bates, despite him being ruled out as the donor of any biological material retrieved from the crime scene. Acquired from Sandy Betts in 2011, I featured a typed letter on my ZodiacKiller.net website from staff at Riverside City College in respect to Ross Sullivan, who they thought was a good candidate in the murder of Cheri Jo Bates. Ross Sullivan was born in Syracuse, New York, from where he moved to Glendale, California, before attending Riverside City College in 1961, and eventually became a library assistant in the college. After the murder of Cheri Jo Bates, in 1968, he moved to Santa Cruz, before dying 9 years later, on September 29, 1977, at age 36. Riverside Police would claim that Ross Sullivan had an alibi for the night of the murder, but despite this, he's become one of the most highly featured Zodiac killer suspects during the last decade. Although we can't conclusively place Ross Sullivan within 75 miles of any known Zodiac crime scenes, we can place him in the vicinity of the murder of Cheri Jo Bates. Along with that, the fact he knew Cheri Jo Bates and worked at the Riverside City College Library. A recent individual I've looked into for the Zodiac crimes, known by the pseudonym McDuff, has placed Ross Sullivan on the back burner for me in recent months, but I've attempted to use this principle in at least placing a suspect's home, residence, or place of work in the geographical location of the crime being investigated. Ross and McDuff may not be the favorite suspect of everyone, but if we can use geographic profiling to narrow down the search field of the perpetrator by analyzing the murders and any confirmed communications mailed by the killer, it can prioritize the focus of any investigation and direct resources in a more targeted approach. Good old-fashioned police work is still the bedrock of any police investigation, but geographic profiling is a valuable supporting tool. Canadian criminologist Kim Rossmo stated, quote, "The San Francisco murder differs significantly from the Zodiac's other crimes. Up to this point, he was hunting in locations that had a good probability of containing his desired victims. Target selection was a function of area, not of an individual. However, it's unlikely that the Zodiac was successful in all of his searches. Serial killers typically engage in extensive hunting activities, and for every attack, there are many unsuccessful search attempts. In San Francisco, however, the Zodiac controlled the situation through a selection of victim type. The need for such control could be indicative of the distance the Zodiac had to travel to the crime scene. Criminals who travel longer distances to offend are less likely to use certain target selection techniques. In respect to the killer's home residence and hot zones identified through geographical profiling, Rossmo continued, "There's a number of possibilities, but remember, Rancho Vallejo was possibly 26,000 people at that time, of which only 13,000 will be white, and only a certain proportion of those are the correct age. Then we start looking at the neighborhoods involved. We have a pretty small subset. Then we start combining that with some of the personal and behavioral descriptors. And then we work in the vehicle information. If this case was active today, it would not be too difficult to find this person."
If we take the path of least resistance, we have Cheri Jo Bates last being seen alive no later than 6:30 p.m. Then the sound of screams coming from the vicinity of the alleyway at approximately 10:30 p.m, given by at least 2 separate ear witnesses. This leaves us a window of 4 hours that Cheri Jo Bates was away from the library, and very possibly in the company of somebody she trusted. If this was the case, then this person has failed to come forward to assist the police with their investigation, meaning they are either reluctant for fear of being implicated in the murder, or they are the murderer. Cheri Jo Bates left her 4195 Via San Jose residence no later than 5 p.m, but was seen just 30 minutes later outside the library by the Mexican-American student. The journey time from her home to the library entrance is a little over 10 minutes, leaving 20 minutes unaccounted for. Is it possible she visited somebody during this period of time who would later factor into the missing 4 hours? Earlier in the day at 3:45 p.m, Cheri Jo Bates had phoned her friend Stephanie Gutman to accompany her to the library, but Stephanie declined the offer. So, did Cheri Jo Bates make alternative plans that evening that may have included driving elsewhere and not directly to the library? The 1969 Inside Detective magazine featured 2 young girls interviewed shortly after the murder. It stated, quote, 2 young girls who said they knew Cheri Jo gave a taped interview to a crew from a Los Angeles television station. The girls in the interview said that Cheri Jo had told them Sunday she was going to the library to meet her boyfriend. However, Sergeant Grinell said that while Cheri Jo had met her boyfriend in San Francisco the weekend prior to her murder, the boy was still in the Bay Area at the time of her death. The statements of the 2 girls were based on hearsay and not on fact, Captain Cross told newsmen. However, it could not be hearsay if the 2 young girls claimed that Cheri told them she was going to the library on Sunday to meet her boyfriend. After the failure to visit the library with her friend Stephanie Gutman, had she made alternative plans with this boyfriend? The mystery boyfriend who met Cheri Jo Bates during the missing 4 hours and then failed to come forward after the murder? Whether this was a stranger or somebody Cheri Jo Bates trusted enough to spend her final few hours may never be known, but the debate rages on. If you type into Google Maps the address of Corona, California, where Cheri Jo Bates' father worked at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory, and view an aerial shot of Corona, you will clearly see the Zodiac crosshairs over Riverside. The question being, did the Zodiac killer take these crosshairs from Southern California to Northern California in 1969 and become the instantly recognizable sign of murder for many years to come? Right, Mike, we covered Ross Sullivan only briefly in the introduction. So can you expand on why Ross Sullivan became a suspect in the first place and the key points that have led to him being considered as the murderer of Cheri Jo Bates and possibly the Zodiac killer?
Well, the suspicion of Ross Sullivan was on the part of the library staff at the Riverside College. He was a volunteer there at the college. He was also a student, and he was someone that was on their radar because he acted strange. He didn't have good hygiene. He was very creepy. Some of the women there just did not want to be in the same room with him. They were that creeped out by him. And following the murder, some people immediately thought of him just because he was so strange and so weird, and they were already frightened of him in their minds. They were suspicious of him, and they did go to the police with their suspicions, but he wasn't on really the Zodiac radar until years later when Dave Peterson, the Vallejo Times Herald reporter, was digging into the Cheri Jo Bates case, and he reached out to that staff. And they told him, hey, we have a suspect that we think is Cheri's killer, and his name is Ross Sullivan. And they sort of laid out this big, 3-page letter of all the things that had creeped them out and why they were frightened of him, why they suspected him. And Peterson became pretty high on him as a suspect. And he sort of went by the wayside and not talked about very much. And it was really on the back burner. Nothing really happened with him. And it wasn't until I don't know how many years ago it was now, a ways back, I'm guessing over 5 years ago, that I started looking just through all these old suspect names. And Ross Sullivan was a name I had seen, but I never really dug into him. So, one day I said, well, let me look at this guy and see what he's all about. So I found the information. I found out he had died in 1977, and I went ahead and found his address and found information about him, found information on an old message board, an old defunct Google forum that's no longer on the internet, and was able to gather those details. And I eventually found out what he looked like. And when I saw the sketch, I remember thinking, oh, wow, he looks, if there's anyone that looks like they posed for the infamous Paul Stein sketch in San Francisco, it was him. So for me, that's where I sort of started looking at him, and we had Zodiac's writing as being in this library, these Bates case letters, him having a link there was pretty big in my opinion. And then when it came out that his brother, Tim, married Cheri Jo Bates' best friend, Bonnie, that was pretty big too, because it was an established link to Cheri herself. And, from there, it sort of took off, and it was a long road looking at different stuff and trying to connect him to different areas where the Zodiac stuff happened.
To play devil's advocate, for people who don't believe Ross Sullivan was the murderer of Cheri Jo Bates or the Zodiac killer, Cheri Jo Bates suffered at least 23 stab wounds, in which many of the blows from the killer may have been deflected, in what was a sustained and prolonged attack lasting at least a minute, probably much longer. She apparently ripped a clump of hair from the killer found at the base of her right thumb in congealed blood. She had skin under her fingernails, probably present through scratching the attacker. She also ripped off his wristwatch. This was a prolonged and vicious murder, which it is arguable that the killer sustained injuries during this attack. The police performed a reconstruction in which they took hair samples, fingerprints, and other measures to identify the killer. It is inconceivable that Ross Sullivan, who knew Cheri and worked at the library, would not have been interviewed and physically examined. And no matter had he disappeared for 2 weeks subsequent to the murder, there is no way any injuries would have disappeared in that time period. How can this be reconciled by somebody promoting Ross Sullivan as her potential killer?
Well, I don't necessarily know, again, what severity the injuries were to Cheri's killer. She definitely seems to have struggled with him and was able to fight a little bit, and it seemingly would injure him. And just to expand on what you said, one of those librarians following Cheri's murder said, if I don't see that guy again, if he's not here at the library after Cheri's murder, in my mind, he's going to be her killer. And sure enough, he wasn't there for 2 weeks or whatever it was following Cheri's murder. So that just raised their suspicions even higher. But again, not knowing the injuries that she suffered, that she inflicted, I should say, on her attacker, I don't know what the severity was or if he would have been noticed. A couple of things that we didn't know at the time about Ross Sullivan that we found out later was he was every bit of 6'2" and probably 265 pounds when he was at Riverside. He was a big guy and he was strong. You could tell some of the photos. I don't think that he would have had a very hard time handling Cheri at the time, which is why I've always been skeptical that he was her killer. Some people thought he was. The library staff definitely thought he was. I think he would have been able to overpower her pretty easily. And some things at the crime scene, there was a wristwatch that was small to medium size. You think someone like Ross would have a bigger wrist. So I've never been really high on him necessarily being her killer, but I did think it was possible he'd have interest in her case and maybe would latch onto it and start writing letters and stuff like that. But I've since cooled on Ross as a suspect over time, mainly because I just could never place him in Vallejo or in that immediate area, despite his height difference being different from most of the reports, which I'm not opposed to someone being off in height. because a lot of times eyewitness stuff can be wrong, but I've just never been able to put a connection to him in Vallejo. And I really think there's one for whoever Zodiac was. I think it was in that area, and I can't place him there, which is why I've always stopped short of saying I think he's definitely the Zodiac. He was high on my list, but he's since definitely been on the back burner for me.
Yeah, that's the difficult part, because he can't be placed within 65, 70 miles of any crime scene, can he?
No, and again, the details have been so hard to gather on him. I did speak to someone that knew him, that had interactions with him in 1968 and early 1969. Couldn't find anyone that had interactions with him during the Zodiac crimes. One person that provided a lot of information that came forward that knew Ross and was good friends with his brother Tim did say that Ross spent time bouncing back between San Francisco and Santa Cruz. So that's definitely puts him in the wheelhouse, but he couldn't really give exact details of where he lived at and what times he lived there. And we also know Ross was in and out of mental institutions. He also had schizophrenia, which, again, anyone with schizophrenia, it's a mental illness. So maybe that in some people's eyes that puts them high on a list. You know, a lot of experts back then thought that Zodiac had schizophrenia, but the downside of schizophrenia is that it's oftentimes, especially if you don't take medication, it's hard to manage it, and people are out of control. They have weird things where they just have like breakdowns and episodes and fits, hallucinations, things like that. You know, we know that in 1968, I think it was, Ross was arrested in Santa Cruz for being nude and trapping a guy inside a telephone booth, and he was taken away and put on in a facility for a couple days. So those kinds of things have always made me wonder, was he rational enough? Could he carry out a plan and like the Zodiac letters and ciphers, could he carry something out like that and do that? I just don't know. But if you believe in the Riverside writing connection, and you believe that Zodiac, whoever he was in that library, Ross was always interesting from that standpoint, because he looks so much like the sketch, and we know he was in that library. And there's never really been anyone put forward as a suspect that was in that library that we know for a fact. So for me, that was always interesting. But as of late, we know, because of some stuff in the Bates case, that there's a possibility some of the Bates stuff was hoaxed. And as we talked about, we also know that some of the Riverside writings later copied by the Zodiac may have been just that, copied, because some of the Bates stuff was in the magazines, in the True Detective magazines. So Zodiac could have read that and copied some of that stuff into his letters. So now that we've got the possibility Zodiac was never in Riverside, and we've got some writing discrepancies where the experts may have been wrong, I'm back to just sticking with the canonical Zodiac crimes. I'm concentrating my focus on the crimes we know were connected to Zodiac. And then if we find out who Zodiac is one day, we can always go back and sort of reverse engineer things and see if he was connected to other crimes. But for me, I'm trying to focus on the ones we know Zodiac was connected to.
Well, let us return back to the Cheri Jo Bates crime scene. Investigators described a blood trail leading from the crime scene to Terracina Drive. We know that frequently in violent, sustained knife attacks, the perpetrator will often cut themselves. One would have thought samples from this blood trail would have been taken to determine whether it originated from Cheri or her attacker. Cheri had an extremely rare blood group shared by only 3% of the American population. So even in 1966, this would have been an easy test to perform. However, this blood was made no mention to in the 1999 DNA report. Even if the blood trail in 1966 was determined to be the rare blood group of Cheri, this doesn't totally exclude the killer as being the donor. Yet this blood was glaringly absent from the DNA report. Surely this blood travelling away from the crime scene to Terracina Drive would have been collected from the crime scene and stored in the correct manner for later testing.
Well, I would hope that would be the case. Obviously, there was no DNA back then, but there was, as you mentioned, you could tell someone's blood type from their blood at least. And I'm a big supporter of law enforcement, but I'm not a big supporter of Riverside police and their efforts to solve this case. There's been a lot of mistakes they've made. They've gone down a lot of rabbit holes. They've had tunnel vision looking at suspects, a favorite suspect they have, despite DNA not matching him, and they refuse to sort of go in any other direction. So, I know one of the detectives that's worked on the case mentioned that Cheri had been stabbed dozens of times, which was not correct. One of the detectives brought the film crew for one of the Zodiac documentaries to the wrong location where Cheri was killed. He wasn't even in the right spot. So to me, it has a lot of issues. They made a lot of mistakes. They've been back and forth on a lot of stuff. I think we talked about when the confession letter came out, they basically said that the killer, the writer, I should say, knew information that only the killer could know, like that the distributor cap wire was pulled. Well, that's not true, because there were reports within a day or two of Cheri's murder saying how the car was disabled. So it just screams to me that there's a mishandling of the case from early on that has lasted all these decades. And so it wouldn't surprise me if they didn't test that blood, or if worst case scenario, if they did and it somehow wasn't Cheri's, but it also wasn't their favorite suspect, would they put any weight into it? Maybe they explained it away in a different way because it didn't match. It was another thing that did not match our suspect. I don't know. We don't have access to those Riverside reports the way we do some of the other reports, but I've just been troubled for a long time about how they've handled the case, the mistakes they've made. And, that would be unfortunate if they never did collect that blood to test to see if it was someone else's.
It seems very odd, because it seems in contradiction to the fact they did seem to take seriously the DNA testing of a cigarette butt from the vicinity of the crime scene, which seems to be the logical conclusion that investigators took the sighting of a female eyewitness to a man standing in the alleyway at 9:30 as a potential murder suspect. And I think the young woman saw a man standing in the alleyway smoking a cigarette. If police thought this testimony as credible, this would negate any notion of a murder prior to 9:30 p.m, as the female eyewitness could not have failed to see the stricken Cheri Jo Bates in the alleyway while walking through it. But they took this DNA testing of a cigarette butt fairly seriously, and I'm assuming they must have taken this from close to the crime scene, yet seemingly no blood trail sampling or testing was mentioned in this report, in contrast.
Yeah, it just goes back to, again, I think they've mishandled it. They didn't collect all the evidence at the scene. They missed some things. I didn't see in the report. It's been so long since I read it. Maybe it is in there. I don't remember being in there, but I don't know that if they even determined or mentioned whether the person that left DNA on the cigarette butt could have also been the person whose DNA was found in Cheri's hand. I can't remember if there was no mention of that. Okay. So we don't know if it came back or if they checked to see if that was one and the same person. Obviously, if the cigarette butt also had the DNA of the person that was found under Cheri's hand, then we would know for sure that it was the guy in the alley was Cheri's killer, most likely. So it's just things like that we see that are still not answered, and we don't have good explanations for it. And even recently with their release of information that the Bates had to die letters were written by a hoaxer, a young teenager at the time. The report is so poorly written, a bunch of us have just gone back and forth trying to figure out the language, because it's just, they can't even release a report that's written accurately and written clearly to make sense. And then I and others have reached out to them in the weeks since they've released this press release for clarification, asking them to please clarify what they meant. And none of us have received responses. So again, I hate to talk bad about law enforcement. For the most part, I think they do a great job. But I really think Riverside has handled Cheri's case poorly since day one.
They did mention in the DNA report testing Cheri Jo Bates' bra. She was stabbed 3 times in the breast region. So whether I mean, obviously you would expect blood to be in that region on her bra, but I was wondering whether maybe they tested that region because that is an area where the killer may have cut himself on the knife, and they were testing whether there was a mixed sample of DNA in that region.
Yeah, it's possible, or maybe we don't know all the details. If her bra was torn, maybe they thought the killer could have handled it or torn it himself. Again, because we're not working with all the records and all the information, it's hard to have a clear picture of what they were thinking or what they were following up on.
Just the final thing on this DNA report, it stated that the suspect's hair was removed from the victim's hand at autopsy. They believed it was from the killer. The mitochondrial DNA analysis ruled out Riverside's main suspect, Bob Barnett, as the donor. How, therefore, can Riverside still maintain their prime suspect was involved in the murder, other than being an accomplice to the crime?
That's the big thing. So since he doesn't fit with the DNA, they have this long story, this long-winded theory that he had to be there, but as a participant, not as in the other person's DNA was found there. It's just, again, it's tunnel vision. They've locked in on this guy. They're, no matter what, he's the guy in their minds. And I wouldn't be surprised if they still think that to this day, that he's the guy. And when there's no evidence tying him to the case, there's nothing. That's why they haven't arrested him, because they don't have a case against this guy. Now, maybe in his part, he's looked suspicious. He left the United States and lived abroad for quite a long time. From my understanding is he's back. But in my eyes, it's clear it's very unlikely he was involved. And if they supposedly have information about another person being involved, they've never arrested that person. So it doesn't hold weight. And I think they're really chasing a false lead here. Sort of like with Arthur Allen. There's so many people that think Arthur Allen was definitely Zodiac, despite ballistics not matching, fingerprints not matching, palm prints not matching. The questionable DNA evidence they have didn't match. Nothing matched. So, but a lot of people still latch on to Arthur Lee Allen. And again, we're 50 plus years later, and we see where he's gone as a suspect. He's gone to the same place that Bob Barnett, who's not his real name, by the way, in the Cheri Bates case, same thing. He's sort of just in limbo there, his name being stuck with this case for decades.
I mean, I agree with you that the confession letter, every detail in it could have been gleaned from the newspapers, because it mentioned in the newspapers coil wire, which is the middle wire of a Volkswagen Beetle. I don't personally believe the confession letter was typed by the killer, but for those that do, I often hear the claim that the author couldn't have known Cheri or went to school with her because he wouldn't type about the brush-offs he had received in the years prior, had he known her, giving away his association to Cheri. Hence, they conclude the author didn't know Cheri Jo Bates. Therefore, if the author knew Cheri, he was correct in suggesting he knew Cheri Jo Bates, because he knew the readers of the confession letter would take the opposite stance. It was effectively the perfect double bluff.
Yeah, in my mind, I don't think there's any way at all to know one way or another whether the confession author knew Cheri or not. I don't think we can know that one way or the other. But to your point regarding, quote unquote, the brush-offs that happened over the years, I mean, there's one of two things. He's either telling the truth and he was brushed off by her, or he wasn't. He was lying. So that's pretty simple. He's either being truthful or he's lying. And I go back to, if you knew Cheri and you were her killer and you had gotten away with it, writing the letter is only going to link you to the crime. Writing that confession letter saying, hey, I knew her, she had brushed me off, that's going to probably get police more focused on people that knew her and had some kind of connection to her. So it wouldn't make sense for someone that knew her to write that letter. On the other hand, a perfect stranger that didn't know Cheri at all and had gotten away with the crime, he doesn't need to write a letter. There's no need for him to write a letter saying she brushed me off and try and mislead the police, because he has no connection to her. So I'm always back and forth on whether the letter writer knew Cheri or not. I tend to go with that he didn't know her and he was just somehow drawn to her case, and he thought that the letter sounded interesting and creepy and sinister the way that he wrote it, and scary. And I really think that much of that stuff in there, he wrote and didn't have a connection to Cheri. But hopefully time will tell. Hopefully somehow we'll find out. We know the Bates had to die letters seemed like they were a hoax. The confession letter is a totally different topic. And we see these cases that are 30, 40, 50 years old being solved all the time, though, with DNA. The DNA doesn't lie. As infallible as, I should say, as law enforcement, as the DNA isn't. If you have good stored DNA and it can be examined and it can be tested and genetic genealogy done on it, it can lead back to the killer through a family tree. Even if they died years ago, they can still be identified. So that's the one thing, despite all of Riverside's failures, if they have a good sample of the killer's DNA someplace and it's enough and it's been stored properly, it could lead to the killer, and that's gonna, wherever it leads, whoever that is, whether that's their pet suspect or not. And I hope that happens. But again, at some point it requires the police being proactive and knowing what to do and how to use it. And I really hate to say it. I hope it's not a case of, well, we don't think it's going to lead to our favorite suspect, so let's not do it. I hope that's not the case, because Cheri deserves justice, and to chase the wrong person for her murder for 50 plus years is just a travesty.
Well, talking about your lack of trust for the Riverside PD and the recent developments on the Bates letters being considered a hoax because of the admission of somebody in 2016, recently I wrote an article called 3 Times to Die, pointing out the language comparison between the Riverside desktop poem and the confession letter, strongly arguing one author was responsible for both. But there is also a connection between these and the Bates letters in that the author of each all used the phraseology to die. The desktop poem was entitled Sick of Living, Unwilling to Die. The confession letter author typed, I said it was about time for her to die. The Bates letters author wrote, she had to die and Bates had to die. The Zodiac killer never used the phrase to die or the word die in any of his communications. Now that the dust has settled over Riverside's claims of a hoaxer admitting to composing the Bates letters, what are your thoughts on the validity that this unknown individual crafted the Bates letters, and is it possible he was responsible for all 3 communications or none at all?
Well, again, because their press release was so confusing and not complete, and they left so many loopholes in it, they could have simply said in the release, okay, so the Bates had to die letters were authored by this teenager, but he did not write the confession letter. If they had wrote something like that, then we would know there's no way. But they didn't. They didn't touch on the confession letter whatsoever, which just has caused more confusion. As far as the desktop poem, that was found in the college. So for me, I have to wonder if the kid was a teenager in 1967. Would he have been in that library? I don't know an instance where teenagers would be in a library in a college to be able to write that poem in the first place. So I'd have a hard time believing that a teenager who wrote a letter in 67 could be in the Riverside Library in the mid-60s. Now, of course, maybe they had some kind of event or some kind of show at the college where the public was able to go in there. I don't know, but ordinarily I would think that the person that was in the college library that left that poem would have had to have been over 18 at the time. And we know that this author of the 67 Bates had to die letters was a teenager. So that sort of is a conflict for me.
To finish this off, I was asked a question by Druza. I thought we'd address this just quickly now. The confession letter appeared cut or torn at the top and bottom. What is your opinion on whether the confession letter was written with plain normal paper and he'd removed some identification from the top and bottom of this normal paper, or the confession letter was typed on teletype roll?
Well, that's an interesting clue, I think. I don't know how many people had access to that. I've heard people like Rick Marshall, a Zodiac suspect, may have had access to that, but it did seem unusual, that type of paper. Maybe it was more common than it is today, I don't know. But interestingly, in the Zodiac case, he had used some odd-sized paper as well. So that was an interesting crossover in clues. I do think that's worth looking into and worth considering. But going back to that, making sure that nothing on that paper could identify him, it was ripped off. He sent a copy of a copy of a copy, basically, to the police and the newspapers because he didn't want to send the original. So he knew enough that his typewriter could somehow be identified, and he didn't want to send the original version, which to me speaks to someone that might be a little bit older, maybe knew about that, had experience with it, maybe had read about it. I find it hard to believe that a teenager would automatically know that if I type this letter and just mail it to them, they're going to know it's my typewriter and be able to determine that, which they would have been able to do. So that the person knew enough to send a copy of a copy so that they couldn't identify the typewriter if it was found. And to me, that just, again, it speaks to someone older, more experienced, more knowledgeable. So it makes sense that they would make sure that the rest of the identification, things that could identify them on that paper, would be taken away as well.
Yes, he used carbon paper between whatever normal or teletype roll he used. And that is the reason I looked up on Wikipedia for the reason he wrote CC at the bottom, meaning carbon copy, or other copies have been sent.
Yeah, and it's again, I think until we solve the case and know who sent some of this stuff or know who killed Cheri, I think we will be able to sort of reverse engineer why they did what they did, and if the letter writer is one and the same as the killer. But again, I'm not holding out a lot of hope because Riverside has bungled so much stuff over the years. Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Zodiac Speaking. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss an episode. New episodes of Zodiac Speaking will air every other Saturday. If you want to follow or interact with us on social media, we'd love to hear from you. You can find Zodiac Speaking on Twitter with the handle @PodcastZodiac. Or you can search Facebook for Zodiac Speaking Podcast.
And don't forget, you can get plenty of Zodiac details 24/7 by visiting my site, zodiacciphers.com, or by going to Mike's site at zodiackillersite.com.
We'd like to take a moment to thank all the people that have reached out to Rich and I to say congrats on starting Zodiac Speaking, or to compliment us on the podcast or the material we've covered so far. We really appreciate all the support, and if you'd like to help us grow, please take a minute to rate us and leave us a review wherever you listen to the show. You can also recommend Zodiac Speaking to your friends. We'll be doing a special Q&A episode coming up, so if you have any questions you'd like to ask, feel free to reach out to us on social media. Or you can email us questions directly at zodiacspeakingpodcast@gmail.com. As we wrap up this episode, Rich and I would like to play a preview for you for a true crime podcast we think you'll like. It's called Murder Bucket. Be sure to give it a listen.
Have you ever seen on the news where a police department goes back through old files to reinvestigate a missing persons case or a homicide to see if they can find what happened or who did it? Did you ever watch the show called Unsolved Mysteries with the original host Robert Stack and get so intrigued that you wanted to know more? Well, Murder Bucket Podcast has you covered. We are currently in a 30-plus episode series called The Cold Case Road Trip. We travel to all 50 states, DC, and 5 inhabited territories. Every Tuesday, I cover a cold case from 2 locations. You can listen to Murder Bucket wherever you get podcasts, such as Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and more. We also have a merch store. Follow the link on linktr.ee/murderbucket and check it out. There might be something there that catches your eye. And finally, follow us on Twitter @TheMurderBucket, Facebook @BucketMurd, and Instagram @MurdBucket.